In today's video, I have come to the far north of Denmark, to this iconic lighthouse. It is actually a couple of years since I was here last time, and today's video theme is wide angle lens mistakes you ought to stop doing, or at least try to avoid them as much as possible. And I want to apologize beforehand because it's quite windy up here, so there might be a little bit of wind noise. Now, the first and most common mistake I see with wide angle photography, and the thing that most beginners do whenever they get their first wide angle, is simply just to shoot too wide and try to include everything in the entire scene. Now, in this particular scene, there's not a whole lot to include. Like, we have huge sand dune here, and we have the lighthouse, we have some tourists, we have the sky. That's about it. But even here, there is still way too many things that you can include on mistake if you're not aware about it. So if we just turn around here, and let's say I want to take a photo of the lighthouse. The main thing to take away here is, you see all this clutter down here in the sand. You want to avoid that. And there are, of course, a few different ways that you can avoid that. You can zoom in like this. Going vertical is probably not the best solution. You can, of course, try to find an angle with less clutter in the foreground. There's a little bit cleaner of a patch down here you can use as the foreground. However, I have found a patch up here, and the main thing that you can actually do to reduce all this foreground or midground clutter is to get down low and get close to the ground, something like this. You can see when I get this low and close to the ground, I exclude, or at least minimize, what is now the midground. You see here I include it by coming a little bit up, and going down here I exclude it. So once you have found your composition and found your angle, and you have excluded all that clutter and gotten close down to the ground, the next mistake you want to avoid in wide angle landscape photography is to have only parts of your scene in focus. For the most part, we want to have the entire scene in focus, and we do that by closing down the aperture to something like f11, f16, maybe even f22. However, when we are this close to the foreground as we are in this example here, even f22 is simply not enough. And for the most part, you want to avoid photographing at f22 because of the fraction that the image gets a little bit soft. So I don't go above f16. So I've come to f16 right now, and then I'm taking 3 photos. I'm taking one photo where the background is in focus, that being the lighthouse. And then I'm taking a photo where the midground-ish is in focus, that's only like a meter into the scene. And then I'm taking one photo where the immediate foreground is in focus. And that is enough to cover the entire plane of focus and get the entire photo in focus. When I combine those 3 photos in Photoshop, I focus stack them. There's a few different ways to do that in Photoshop, either manually, automatically, which is not always super satisfying. And then there's some different third-party plugins you can also use for that. I show how to do it in simple scenes and in complex scenes in my huge Photoshop for Landscape Photographers post-processing course. There's a link down in the description with a coupon code that you can use to sign up for that. I of course show a whole lot of other things in that Photoshop course too. So I have just come like a few meters back and found another composition I also really like. So I was down there just before, and now I have moved up and I'm here. And I kind of like these patterns here a little bit more, I think, because they lead you more into the lighthouse. The other streaks kind of let you either out to one side or to the other side. I'm a little bit unsure what works the best. Right now the weather isn't particularly great either. I want to wait for sunset and hopefully I get a little bit softer light, a little bit more interesting shadows. But then again, I don't know. The play between the blue sky and the yellowish foreground here, sandish beige foreground here, may also work. So I'll put the photos up and then you can see which one you prefer. I'm curious to know which one of these two photos that you like the composition of the most. So yeah, let me know down in the comments. So another mistake I often see when you do wide-angle landscape photography is that the background subject, which in my case is the lighthouse, just becomes so tiny small that it's almost an irrelevant part of the scene, that there's much more emphasis on the foreground than there actually is on the subject. And it's always a hard balance to strike, because in this example here from another lighthouse, I actually prefer the photo where the lighthouse is smaller. You are kind of more drawn into the scene than the one where the lighthouse is bigger. And my best suggestion to avoid making your photos too small is obviously to zoom in a little bit, not shoot as wide as you absolutely can, but make sure to both get a photo where you are a little bit more zoomed in, so you have a little bit larger subject, and then also try one where you're a little bit more zoomed out. In this case here, I am actually shooting at, all the way out at 16mm. So for my own sake, I will also zoom a little bit in and get a photo where the lighthouse is a little bit larger in the frame. And you can check that one out here. And here is the other one from before as a comparison. So another mistake you want to avoid when you're photographing with a wide-angle lens, and that is to use a polarizing filter in the wrong way. Right now I have the polarizing filter attached to the camera. And as you can see, we have the sun over there. So 90 degrees to the sun, we also have the polarizing effect. So now that I turn the filter, you can see how the sky, I'm leaving out the polarized light in the sky and it gets darkened. And that's all fine and dandy. The only problem is that the polarized part of the sky is in this band all the way around and also over here. And shooting with a wide-angle lens, I'm also including the non-polarized parts of the sky. And it looks a little bit weird having this darker part right here in the middle. So you will have to compensate for that in post-processing. The only problem is that compensating for that in post-processing is a nightmare. It can be super frustrating. You can get a lot of banding in the sky. You can't get the tones exactly right or near to each other. So yeah, it's just annoying. You, for the most part, want to avoid that. So the only thing you basically can do when you're shooting with a polarizing filter and a wide-angle lens is to zoom in, and then the wide-angle effect kind of gets nullified. Alternatively, you can shoot vertical, and that is usually what I do when I use a polarizing filter, or zoom in. But those were the two options that was there. And I know I'm going to get a trillion questions about what polarizing filter I'm using. Right now I'm using the K&F Concept Nano X variable 82mm filter, which also has a built-in polarizing filter. So yeah, they sent me this filter. They wanted me to try it out, and it's basically the first time I'm using it, so I don't really have any idea whether it's good or bad or sharp or works as intended. But yeah, that's the filter I'm using. If you so far enjoyed this video, I'd highly appreciate a like. It's completely free and goes a long way to show the YouTube algorithm my videos are worth showing to others. And let me know in the comments below which one photo is your favorite from this video. Another mistake you want to avoid when you do wide-angle lens landscape photography is an overemphasis on the foreground. What I've kind of already talked about in regard to focal length, but generally when you're shooting with a wide-angle lens and you're putting a lot of emphasis on the foreground, make sure you don't put too much on it. You can zoom in as I just talked about, but it's also about what it is you place in that foreground, what you decide to include in that foreground. Is it relevant to the scene behind you? Does it add anything to the photo? In this case here, I've just come a little bit down the dune and I'm including these bricks laying right here. Now, taking this photo, I was actually aiming for something that didn't make a whole lot of sense to include. At the very least, they don't look particularly aesthetic. But there is actually a story right here about decay. Obviously, we have old lighthouse, which has been moved from over here to over here. And then we have bricks laying around from the lighthouse, from the old buildings that has been taken down that were here. So by including this foreground, I'm actually adding to the story, even though it's not a particularly aesthetic foreground. But I hope you get what I mean. Don't include some random stuff in your foreground just for the sake of including it. When I included the lines in the dune, I told the story about this lighthouse being standing in this dune, which is also interesting and fascinating and kind of unique. Whereas with the stones right here, the bricks, I'm telling a story of decay. So two completely different stories, but both foregrounds are relevant. So I'm reaching that point in photographing this lighthouse where I just have sand everywhere, like in my mouth, in my nostrils, in my eyes, in my camera bag, in my camera, like everywhere. But the next mistake you definitely want to avoid is to get too close to a subject with the wide angle. When you are as close as I am right here, you can see I have some bricks here, foreground, and then I'm actually rather close to it. You get this very distorted effect where you're kind of looking up to the lighthouse. You don't see it from the side, you're seeing it from underneath and looking up. Now this can be an effect that you want if you want to have it like, towering up and being majestic and all those stuff. But as you can see here in this vertical photo, you get a very, very distorted view of the lighthouse. And in my humble opinion, not a super flattering view either. Now this is particularly emphasized when you're photographing buildings. When I photograph trees, I don't find it to be a massive problem. Obviously you don't want to get too close to mountains either, because they have a tendency to just look fairly weak when you get too close to them, because they're so tall and actually not steep when you get close to them. But especially with buildings like this lighthouse, it usually doesn't work for me, because it just gets like super distorted with a very wide angle look. So I'm in this weird angle because the wind is from there. Hopefully that covers the microphone, and I'm just getting so much wind also from there because that's where the wind is. It is extremely important for me to emphasize that, as with all landscape photography, you need to take all these tips as tips that you may use in certain situations. They don't always work. So I found this composition right here where I'm using some of those tips, yet I'm also kind of going against some of those tips ish, because right here, as you can see, I'm actually not that close to the ground. I'm not all the way down. So I really like the patterns here in the foreground. I'm a bit further up. I'm also still relatively close to the lighthouse. As you can see, even here on the video, it is having a little bit of distorted effect. I'm kind of looking up on the lighthouse. I've also attached the polarizing filter, And even though I'm shooting all the way out at 16mm, but shooting vertical, it is not the entire part of the sky which the polarizing filter is covering. So I will have to compensate for that in post-processing. On purpose, I'm not entirely excluding all the background behind the lighthouse either. It gives a little bit more depth to the scene, but also because I wanted to have this height above the ground so that I could actually see all the beautiful texture here in the foreground. So for this particular photograph, I have used some of the tips, I've gone against some of the tips, and that is just so important when you do landscape photography. Each composition is unique and you have to adapt to the situation again and again and again all the time. So if you do want to learn more about composition and landscape photography, be sure to get my 2 ebooks. I approach it in a way where I talk about compositional tools, not rules. It's not something that you have to apply. It's not rules you have to follow. It's tools that you can use in the field and apply in different scenes, in different conditions, depending on the scene that you're photographing. So if you're in doubt about whether you want them or not, there are 2 light versions down in the description. A lot of people are happy about them. Lots of 5-star reviews on my selling page. So yeah, links down in the description for them, and I hope you will enjoy them. So speaking of distortion, another thing you need to be very much aware of when it comes to shooting with a wide angle is, as you can see here, it's not a big problem in this scene because I tend to put the lighthouse straight in the middle. But if I had any kind of subject or object out in the side as I put the lighthouse right now, you get this very awful distortion where it kind of like tips into the scene. Even if I put it up here, it starts like tipping out of the scene. This distortion is especially bad when you're photographing any kind of like tall things. Now it could even be like a human being that I put out in the side, and that would actually make the human being a little bit broader, fatter than they are. So also be very much careful about that when you're shooting with a wide angle lens. You make sure that your subjects and objects and so forth are quite well into the scene, so you don't get this kind of unfortunate distortion. So the wind is picking up, which is making this so much harder to work with, but the light is just getting better and better and better. Now another mistake, or at least I consider it a mistake, is to have the perception that landscape photography have to always been taking in landscape format, so in horizontal format. I once got a comment on one of my YouTube videos which were like, I cannot fathom that anybody wants to shoot vertical. Like, it's landscape photography, you can shoot plenty of verticals, as I've hopefully already showed in this video and in so many other videos. So yeah, definitely go for vertical if it makes sense to the scene. Like, the final product will still look very, very nice. The final print, it looks beautiful as a poster, landscape photography in vertical format. So definitely avoid to only shoot in landscape mode. Landscape mode is beautiful, vertical mode is also beautiful. That's actually also one of the chapters in my landscape composition 2 ebook, vertical or horizontal. As the sun came down, the wind increased, which continually made the conditions harder and harder to work in. The good thing was that most of the tourist footprints were washed out very quickly, and I managed to get these golden hour photos too. In my big Photoshop for Landscape Photographers course, I cover all the different techniques I use to edit these photos. How to focus stack, how to extract details in the foregrounds, how to dodge and burn, how to clean your photos from debris, how to manage colors and edit with luminosity masks, and how to add glow and atmosphere. I've built up the course progressively as to make sure the transition from only using Lightroom to start using Photoshop is as easy as possible. There is a coupon code in the description in case you want to save a little money. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you can spare a like, I'd highly appreciate it. And as mentioned, let me know what photo from this video you liked the most.